Hello, welcome to Dan's Model Works today. You can tell by the messy workbench that you're looking at Dan's Model Works. Of course, this is part 2 of our Wildcat build. It's a monogram kit dating all the way back to 1961. If you've watched part 1, you will have seen that really there was no interior inside this kit. So let's just pop it apart here. So this is where we are so far. With the exception of this little headrest you see here, everything that's inside here I had to create using little bits of plastic, wire, snot, whatever. So, and the idea is let's just put an acceptable interior inside here. Something that'll make me happy. So, we're getting ready to put the fuselage sides together. One thing that we do still have to do is this aftermarket engine that I bought a few years ago. You had to make sure that it's completely happy in its new home. And how many times did I hit my camera mount? All right. One of the things we will have to do is probably drill this out so that we can put the kit propeller shaft in there. So I'll be investigating that to see just exactly the best way to make that happen. And then we can install the engine and we can get into the main assembly of the Wildcat here. Looking at the propeller here, let's just focus in. Not sure if the camera picks it up, but there's a little bit of flash around the ends of the blades. So we'll want to be sanding that down. There's also a line here, which I suppose is probably supposed to indicate the yellow propeller tips. I'm probably not going to go out of the way to sand that down. I'm probably just going to use it as a guide for when I put my masking tape on there. I think it'll still probably look okay. Now, looking at the instructions, you can see what's intended is they have the shaft, which runs through the middle of the cowling into the propeller. And that all goes together at an early stage. Now, with our build, if you remember from part 1, there we go, we don't have all that. That whole original engine front has been carved out, so we're not going to be using that method. This is what we're dealing with. Now, this resin casting here, the front is separate from the back, and if I recall, before I glued it together, there's a little bit of a pocket inside here. So if I was to drill this out, I could still install this shaft, and then I can put my propeller on at the end here. So that's the slightly more difficult way of doing it, because it'll involve breaking these two parts apart, which I don't imagine will be a big deal in drilling a hole. The easier method, I think, would be simply to drill this to a sufficient depth, cut off the heavy lug, mount the shaft onto the propeller, and just simply set it in place when the model is done. And it will still enable the propeller to turn for posing purposes, but you'll be able to just pull it in and out. So I'm not sure whether I should go for super simplicity or having it retained in place. I'm kind of leaning towards just simply drilling a hole, because that way I can just plop the propeller in at the very end of the build. All right, the decision on the engine has kind of been made for me regarding how the shaft is going to be put in place, because I was almost all the way through drilling as far as I wanted to, and the halves came apart. Not the end of the world. I just had them super glued together anyway. But if we look inside here, in order to put the shaft in from the back side, which would be nice, I'm going to have to grind away huge amounts of one of these engine parts, and I'm just not going to go there. So the plan is going to be put the front and rear parts of the engine back together again, and I'll install the shaft on the propeller, and then it will just be installed at the end of the build. Sometimes a decision is made for you. The cylinders and the crankcase of the engine have been given a coat of Humbrol gunmetal, and I'm just about to paint the gear housing there, some light gloss gray. Alright, I've basically dry brushed the finning on the engine with some tester silver, but the only thing I have left to do here engine-wise is there's some molded in wiring on the fronts of the cylinders, so I'm going to hit that with some flat black. Hopefully I won't screw anything up. The wires on the fronts of the cylinders have been painted. Just going to set this aside to dry for a couple hours, and then I think we're going to be ready to mount it inside the fuselage, and we can move on to the major assembly of the Wildcat now. I've got to make a decision here. My original plan was glue the engine in and then put the fuselage sides together. That was my original plan. Now I've been thinking about it, and the engine will go in the front with the fuselage sides glued together. And I'm thinking, instead of putting the engine in and hoping I've got it centered, and then putting the fuselage side on and then maybe it not being right, maybe it would be a better idea to put the sides together, make sure all that's happy first, and then I'll slide the engine in. Then all I'll have to do is just wiggle her back and forth and maybe prop it up until it dries centered. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to glue the fuselage sides together before I do anything else, like put the engine in. I applied a little bit of Tamiya model cement to the back of my instrument panel because it's so slow drying. I'm going to use some clothespins to hold the tail together, and then I'm going to use a faster setting glue and work my way around the fuselage, hopefully get everything all buttoned up that way. Alright, after about 20 or 30 minutes of clamping by hand, well, watching some YouTube videos to keep myself occupied, the seam's pretty much, I'd say, 98% closed up. Gonna have to do a little bit of filling and sanding here on the fin, but mostly I've had a little bit of plastic squeeze out all the way along, which is okay because you're going to be sanding that down versus trying to fill it. As I said before, this will still have to be addressed, but I'm going to put this wing panel on here before I do anything else, and that'll help to stabilize things up a bit. Okay, now I've got the upper wing panel on the right hand side glued in, a couple clothespins holding it in place. It's nice to be able to be moving beyond all that interior detailing that I was doing earlier. Now you can see the level of the gap that we have on the underside, although I'm just looking, and if I just simply squeeze down, I can close most of that gap. Same thing on the other side. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold the gap closed, and I'm going to run some fast setting liquid cement in there, and let's see if we can maybe eliminate 90% of the gap. Okay, I'm pretty happy about that. It took 20 minutes of clamping with my fingers, but most of that huge gap has been closed up. Same thing on the other side. Most of the gap has been closed. Still a little bit here. I'll probably fill that using just a little bit of white glue. There's still, right here, is a gap that's got to be filled up, but I'll use some Tamiya putty on that. But really, a lot of the gaps got filled just simply by a lot of clamping force and a fairly fast-acting plastic cement, so I'm happy with that. Now, while I'm waiting for various bits of filler to dry, you can see these little bumps here. I'm sure they represent part of the cockpit, or the canopy structure. I'm going to have to remove those, or there's no way this canopy is ever going to go in place. Alright, I've been holding off on installing the engine until I get the fuselage in a little bit better shape. One of the things I've been concentrating on is fitting the canopy over top of the turtleback here. One of the things that I didn't like was the fact that even in the slid back position, this simply did not fit. There was no way it was going to fit on top of there. So I've filed down the turtleback, and I'm not too worried about losing a little bit of rivet detail there because, of course, the canopy is going to be on top of it. But at least now the canopy sits on here. Also, to improve the appearance of the canopy is, let's see if we can focus in on here. I've beveled just the leading edge and the trailing edge of the canopy, just using an X-Acto knife. And I've maybe only removed about 20% of the width, but when it gets painted up, hopefully it will look a little bit thinner than it was. It's still never going to be the equivalent of a vac form canopy, but I think it's really improved over the way it did look. Now, I've already done an initial filing of the seams, and I put a little bit of filler here. And then once I've got all these seams looking the way I want them to, I'll put the engine in. Okay, I've done a little more sanding. One thing I did notice, there was a sink mark up here on the top of the cowling. So put a little bit more putty in there. The areas where the wing root didn't even touch, they've been sanded out. This requires a little bit more putty. This side here, I'm fairly happy with that side. So, the basic sanding down of the fuselage is coming along. Probably going to regret this, but while waiting for various putties to dry, I thought I'd glue the tail feathers on. Of course, one of the things you always have to make sure is, do you have everything perpendicular and square? Looks pretty good. Hopefully I don't snap these off 2 or 3 times during the rest of the build. I took some neutral gray, Tester's neutral gray, and just painted it over the areas where I'd puttied and done a lot of sanding. And this is always a good idea, because it'll oftentimes show up, marks and flaws that still need a little bit of work. This is still a little bit wet in places, but if we look at the joint of the wing root, you can see how much better that is than what it originally was. Now, there is a small dip up there. I'm not going to worry about that one, because the canopy's going to be over top of that, and I think that'll hide that fairly well. So I can start moving on to attaching the wings and getting that engine in place now. Time to get the engine mounted. You may recall that I had created kind of an engine mounting pad inside there. It's not a very precise fit, but I want it to be fairly strong. So what I've done is I've put a little bit of Lepage's contact cement water base on the back of the engine and on the mounting pad. It dries very, very fast. It's not like the older contact cements where we had to wait like 20 or 30 minutes. Let's get this in here. And hopefully the contact cement will allow me to wiggle it around a little bit before it sets up. Now, if I check the side, you can see that vertically it seems to be sitting there fairly level. And same thing horizontally, side to side. And it seems to be fairly well centered in there. Just going to put a little bit of super glue here and here to make sure everything is all locked in place. Now here's a quick test fit of the cowl. Seems to be getting along all right with the new engine. Certainly has a lot more depth than the original installation. I'll be gluing that on soon. A test fit of the right wing shows that there's a little bit of a step right here and a little bit of step on the underside. You can see the front doesn't line up quite as well as it should. So I'm going to make some adjustments to these tabs here and see if I can make that fit a little bit better. There you can see the wing lines up a little bit better now. And a lot of the step is gone. Alright, this wing's been glued in place. I'm reasonably happy with it. The left wing, from above, it doesn't look too bad. From underneath, we've got some pretty tragic gaps going on here. So I'm going to have to do some fiddling with it, see if we can get that closed up. I've packed out some of the large gaps with some styrene. I'll rub those down, and hopefully when we get it primed, it won't be obvious that I've added any material in there. I airbrushed, or rather I should say I spray painted the propeller yellow, mainly concentrating on the tips. I find that by the time you've brush painted the tips and gotten a nice good coat of yellow paint, you've got an awful lot of paint on the propeller tips. So that's why if I've got any yellow spray paint handy, I'll usually use it. If you look closely, you can see there's very faintly the line where it'll need to be masked. I deliberately did not sand that off because I'm always a little paranoid that I'm going to end up not getting my masking tape on exactly right. On the back side, though, I noticed that the line is in a different place on
the third propeller blade. So I'm going to have to put my masking on the front and then base my back masking on that. So once I get the masking tape on, I'll shoot this with some flat black. I've put the masking tape on, and now it's about time to give it a shot of flat black paint. Black paint is dry. Let's see how good or terrible this looks. I think they look fairly symmetrical. This one here isn't perfect, but I think it looks pretty good. Now that we have a nice smooth coat of flat black on our propeller, it's time to paint the propeller hub nice bright silver color. There we can see the propeller. It's all ready to go now. As you can see, I've basically primed the wing fold joints with neutral gray, and if you recall how large the gaps were, they're still not perfect, but basically what we were aiming for was to get it to look like a large panel gap that you would expect to find where the wings would fold. I didn't use filler in the gaps as much as I put down some carpenter glue and then wiped it afterwards, and that just is a good way of filling in some panel lines that are too wide and too obvious without completely filling them in and losing all your surface detail. So this pretty much concludes part 2 of our Wildcat build. In part 3, we'll be painting it and decaling it, as well as putting the landing gear in, which we'll probably actually do before. Some of it we'll do before we paint it all up. So until next time, thanks for watching Dan's Model Works, and see you again next time on part 3. Keep modeling.